Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first of our main conferences. Today we have the pleasure to host Joan Ockman as our keynote speaker. We would like to thank her for accepting our invitation and also for her generous support during the last months as a member of the scientific committee. Joan Ockman is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design and served as director of the Temple Honey Bull Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia University from 1994 to 2008. She was a member of the faculty of Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation for over 2 decades. In addition to Columbia and Penn, she has also taught at almost every American university you can think of: Yale, Harvard, Cornell, Cooper Union, Graduate Center of City University of New York, and also at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam. Joan Ockman started her career in the 1970s at the Institute of Urban Studies in New York, where she had a significant hand in shaping both Opposition Journal and Opposition Spokes. The subtitle of the magazine, Journal for Ideas and Criticism in Architecture, gives a good idea of its intention to foster the emergence of a critical voice independent of academic and professional institutions. In 1985, she edited a book titled Architecture, Criticism, Ideology, which collected the revised papers of a symposium held in 1982 at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. The book addressed the dilemma of postmodernism in a time where it was still regarded more as a polemical stylistic movement than a broad critical or historical category. From then on, if we look at Joan Ockman's production as editor, critic, and writer, we will find many of the most relevant books that every architect has to go through. Her award-winning Architecture Culture 1943-1968, a documentary anthology, became a reference book since it was first published in 1993 and is now in its 5th printing. It also became a sheet to other editorial projects, as is the case of Michael Hayes' Architecture Theory since 1968, which admittedly claims to be a continuation of Joan's book. In 2000, she organized the workshop and conference, The Pragmatist Imagination, Thinkings About Things in the Making, at Columbia and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, for which she edited the publication of the same title. Connections to the proposed topic for the present conference are obvious and are made clear when we notice the intrinsic paradox of its title. Her latest book, Architecture School, 3 Centuries of Educating Architects in North America, attempts to document the still largely uncharted territory of architectural education since the 19th century and into the present. Her demonstrated preferences for text compilations is a good proof of her need to offer total and therefore complex, comprehensive explanations, which are articulated through a discourse always supported in several voices. It is there, in the middle of this woven fabric of relations, that Joan unfolds her amazing critical skills and builds an always new insight into the old topics of architecture. We are sure that today, taking Tafuri and Benham by the hand, she is going to do it once more.
So, conjuring with ghosts or geists, a dialectical fairy tale. When was modernity? Did it begin in 1851, 1900, 1789, 1776, 1492? And where was it? Hypothetically, at least, history is like a loaf of bread that can be cut in many places. In A Singular Modernity, Frederick Jameson ticks off no fewer than 14 plausible starting points for the epoch we loosely call modern. But if we agree with Jameson that historians cannot not periodize, we should also bear in mind that the place we put the knife, which beginning, matters to the story we tell. If, for instance, we choose to ascribe the origins of modernity to the Industrial Revolution and its associated phenomena, then our narrative will tend to privilege technology as the engine of history. On the other hand, if we take the French Revolution as a threshold event, then we will be according priority to Enlightenment values and democratic social ideals as animating forces. These respective origins, which inevitably also have geopolitical implications, will in turn lead us to conclude that modernity has been either a colossal success or, at the very least, an incomplete and uneven project. The canonical histories of modern architecture tend to position themselves in different ways with respect to the dialectic of scientific and social progress. We could assemble an instructive catalog: Kaufman, Gideon, Pevsner, Zevi, Banham, Benevolo, Collins, Tafuri, Frampton, Cahoon, Cohen, et al. As our exhibits, noting who starts with, say, the Crystal Palace, and who with Boulay and Ledoux. In doing so, we could also become aware of how much the story's ending and the time and place it is being told, not to mention the historian's own particular predispositions, condition the choice of beginning. What Jameson, a postmodernist Marxist, if that label is not a complete oxymoron, ultimately proposes as a kind of thought experiment in his book, is that we replace the concept of modernity with capitalism. Not surprisingly, this more or less is the position taken by Manfredo Tafuri as well, as we shall see. In what follows, two historians of the last generation will be the focus of our attention. They are mirror images in more than just a physiognomic way. Manfredo Tafuri and Rainer Banham. Between Banham's archaeology of the future and Tafuri's historical project may be situated a number of critical questions about the theory and practice of architecture that still haunt our discipline today. Banham's theory and design in the first machine age of 1960 begins with Tony Garnier's Beaux-Arts plan of 1899 for a national bank and ends with Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion House, initially conceived in the late 20s. And here we might just, I know it's hard to read, but simply Banham in the 50s or in 1960, commenting on how futurist the world as it exists, as it actually exists, seems to be. So here's this first and actually penultimate plate of theory and design in the first machine age. In his book, Banham accuses the architects of the first 3 decades of the 20th century of not taking seriously enough the consequences of the technology of their day. While the pioneering figures of the modern movement celebrated the first machine age with their iconic forms, they failed, as he says, to acquaint themselves with it very closely. In A Concrete Atlantis of 1986, he elaborates, quote, "The forms of factories and grain elevators were an available iconography, a language of forms whereby promises could be made, adherence to the modernist credo could be asserted, and the way pointed to some kind of technological utopia. Yet the actual technology that architects employed in their buildings was fairly rudimentary, with rare exceptions, Fuller being one, the engineer's aesthetic that Le Corbusier exhorted his fellow architects to emulate remained just that, in Banham's judgment, and aesthetic, dressing up academic thinking. In the wake of World War II, the brave new world of modern technology appeared both exhilarating and frightening, especially to those who had experienced firsthand its formidable power to destroy as well as to create. Banham, initially trained as a mechanical engineer, never wavered in his belief in its emancipatory potential. Those of his generation who, quote, interrupted their architectural training to fight a war in order to make the world safe for the modern movement, as he puts it, could ill afford to backpedal. A rift with his close colleagues Peter and Alison Smithson, whose new brutalism he had previously championed in a long article in Architectural Review, occurred over their deliberately atavistic installation for an exhibition titled This Is Tomorrow, held in 1956 at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which, taking the form of a low-tech, post-apocalyptic bicycle shed, appeared to him perversely to countermand everything their Fuller-inspired House of the Future of the very same year represented. For all his freewheeling pop culture sensibility, Banham was deeply serious in his demand that architects pursue bold and innovative environmental and building techniques. His book, The Architecture of the Well-Tempered Environment of 1969, gave that subject its first careful history, something Siegfried Gideon's earlier Mechanization Takes Command of 1948 had failed to provide. Throughout his career, he remained largely impervious to technology's imbrications with relations of power and matters of ideology, exuberantly affirming a new throwaway economy and the multifarious conveniences of a booming, gadget-obsessed consumer society. Resolutely forward-looking, he had little tolerance for traditionalist sentimentality. His all-out attack on the neo-bourgeois historicist tendency that sprang up in Italy under the name of neo-liberty in the mid-1950s, epitomized by Gabetti and Isola's ornamented Bottega d'Erasmo in Turin, and the medievalizing Velasca Tower in Milan by the firm of Ernesto Rogers, led the latter to brand him the custodian of Frigidaires. Yet, if his attitude toward technology was pragmatic and bloody-minded, as he said, he was also responsible for introducing into the history of modern architecture a handful of utopian visionaries who had been left out of previous accounts, including the apostle of glass architecture, Paul Scheerbart, author of a curious 1914 tract on that subject, which combines wild prognostications about a millennial crystalline world with surprisingly practical technical ideas, and also the young futurist Antonio Sant'Elia, and of course his hero figure, Fuller. Banham wrote his history of the first machine age explicitly from the vantage point of his own second machine age, the 1950s, an age dominated by domestic electronics, jet plane travel, synthetic chemicals, and of course television, the new cool medium of mass communications. His critical intent was to wake architects up to the fact that they were already living in a period of futurism realized. Today, a quarter century after his death, and on the other side of the regressions of what he called a hokey-jokey postmodernism, his technological imperative is back in the ascendant. Architects today are fully on board with the contemporary revolutions in digital and environmental technology, eager to collaborate with advanced engineering in more than just a superficial way. In this sense, 21st century architecture, presumably now in its third or maybe fourth machine age, depending again on how you periodize, has finally become modern. Banham's ghost is no doubt feeling vindicated. Tafori's ghost, not so much. Capitalism's hegemony in 2014 hardly offers more reason than in 1973 to place hopes in design, as the Venice historian puts it in the concluding salvo of Progetto e Utopia, scornful of architects who continue to put their faith in rationalized design methodologies to solve the large-scale structural and systemic problems of late capitalist society. Tafori's remark is specifically directed against the Argentine artist, theorist, and former director of the Ulm School of Design, Tomás Maldonado, whose book La Speranza Progettuale, in English, Design, Nature, and Revolution Toward a Critical Ecology of 1970, had appeared 3 years earlier than his own book. But it might just as well have been directed against Banham, whom Tafori elsewhere calls the paladin of technological optimists. For Tafori, capitalism, with its sweeping reorganization of the relations of industrial production, was the definitive phenomenon of modernity. He therefore somewhat petulantly insisted on labeling the work of his own day hypermodernism, rejecting the newly fashionable term postmodernism. The latter implied that advanced capitalism had somehow managed to supersede itself by the late 20th century, rather than, in fact, greatly enlarging its imperial reach. To pass beyond modernity for Tafori meant transcending the existing economic system, its social relations and political institutions, a prospect that hardly appeared on the horizon to him, all the less so a couple decades later after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Therefore, as he notoriously wrote in Progetto and Utopia, in a passage that resounds with the counterculture lingo of its day as much as with Marxist orthodoxy, there could be no architecture for a liberated society. There could only be a class criticism of architecture, a critique of architecture in its function as ideology. For Tafori, then, it was not modernity that had ended, but the ideological construct of modernism. If for Banham, a truly modern architecture had hardly begun, for Tafori, it was now history. The most radical experiences of architectural modernism had been a euphoric response by a vanguard culture to the new processes of modernization. Progressive architects believed that by intervening in these processes, through the agency of design, they could help achieve a better world. But the ensuing crises of the mid-20th century, culminating in the deep disillusionment of left-wing culture in the late 1960s, had exposed the naivete of this hope. 2 years after the publication of Progetto, 2 decades, after the publication of Progetto and Utopia, in a brief preface to his final book, The Ricerca del Rinascimento, published in 1992, only ostensibly confined to a study of what he now took to be modernity's ultimate origin point, the Italian Renaissance, Tafori described his historiographic task as an elaboration of mourning. This melancholy project was aimed at both unsettling our present, as he puts it, and more therapeutically confronting the crippling sense of loss that the extinction of the modernist project had engendered in those of his generation who had been true believers. Certainly both Marx and Nietzsche had forewarned that the experience of modernity would be traumatic. Walter Benjamin had attempted to put a positive spin on things in the 1960s, welcoming the withering of the artwork's aura under the impact of mechanical reproduction as part of a passage to a more democratic form of culture. The conservative Viennese critic Hans Zedelmeier, on the other hand, had deplored the loss of center in a despiritualized universe dominated by science and technology. Another experience of loss noted by Tafori was that of meaning, or of what the Romanian art historian Robert Klein called the slow agony of the referent, exemplified by the evolution from the perspectival representation of the Renaissance to 20th century abstraction. Yet all these deracinating experiences had been more or less successfully absorbed by modernist culture during the first half of the 20th century, precisely through the invention of new aesthetic forms and concepts. After the 1960s, however, it was the very idea of modernism itself that was no longer credible. No longer could it lay claim to be an agent of redemption and transformation with respect to all the other losses. Mourning, Freud writes in Mourning and Melancholia of 1917, is a longing for something that can never return, a response to the shattering of a relationship to something loved. And there are two possible outcomes to this process. Either the subject successfully completes the work of grieving and moves on, or else she continues to brood, becoming permanently melancholic. Loss is introjected and takes over part of the self. Tafori's project of writing the history of mourning was an effort to come to grips with disillusionment, to exorcise the despair induced by the foreclosure of architecture's heroic aspirations. But the very act of writing was also, perhaps, the expression of a principle of hope, or at least the recording of the existence of a desire for something radically different. As such, it might permit one, as the art historian T.J. Clark suggests in his book, Farewell to an Idea, Episodes from a History of Modernism of 1999, a project comparable in many ways to Tafori's. Through writing, it might be possible finally to make peace with the modernist utopia. It's not clear whether Tafori, who died in 1994, ever completed the work of mourning. Certainly after the 1970s, he rarely addressed himself to questions of contemporary architecture directly, at least not in print, a decision that many in Italy and elsewhere took as a betrayal. There was an acutely felt need to move beyond his bleak generational perspective, to exorcise Tafori himself. Indeed, the paralyzing effect his criticism had on architectural practice succeeded in giving criticism a bad name, one that has persisted up to the post-critical discourse of our own time. Yet in my view, his book, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, Avant-Gardes and Architecture from Piranesi to the 1970s, published in 1980, constitutes an extraordinarily poetic and profound addio to modernism. Intellectually extremely challenging, historically rich and original, the volume is an effort to write the history not of modern architecture per se, but of the idea of the avant-garde in architecture, weaving a series of essays that he had produced over the course of the 1970s into a grand récit. As its subtitle implies, it is, like Banham's theory in design in the first machine age, a history written backward, a book explicitly provoked by the critical dilemmas of his own time. More specifically, it's an attempt to reckon with the emergence of a self-proclaimed neo-avant-garde in Italian and international architecture in the 1970s, a repetition phenomenon about which he was, of course, deeply skeptical. The Sphere in the Labyrinth opens with an extended disquisition on the historian's method entitled The Historical Project. While the tone of his earlier theoretical statements, both Theories and History of Architecture of 1968 and Architecture and Utopia, Progetto e Utopia of 1973, had been declamatory, if not outright polemical, here Tafori's tone is interrogative, searching, indeed agonized with respect to his own vocation. The word project, now applied to the work of the historian, appears in scare quotes. Of course, this particular statement here is pretty declamatory, but the overall tone of this extraordinary introduction is is questioning over and over every statement. He draws an analogy between historical analysis and psychoanalysis, the latter, again according to Freud, an interminable process whose conclusions remain perpetually provisional, never to be resolved with absolute finality. The Sisyphean task of the historian is thus both to construct a narrative of historical events and then to deconstruct it again, to re-examine its foundations, lest it become set in stone, a new mythology, an institution in its own right. Critical history thus always emerges out of a crisis, a word etymologically related to it. In this sense, it is the diametric opposite of operative history, Tafori's term also, a tendentious and confident interpretation of history that functions as propaganda for the historian's particular point of view and idea about the future. It must be acknowledged, though, that the overall structure of the Sphere and the Labyrinth to some extent contradicts this project of self-doubt that Tafori sets out in his introduction, which happened to be written after all the other chapters and clearly comes under the impact of the post-structuralist theories that by the late 1970s had become dominant in intellectual discourse. All the major post-structuralist thinkers, from Foucault, Barthes, and Derrida to Deleuze, make cameo appearances in the historical projects, mostly in a negative context. But in the book's 5 central chapters, which concern the classic avant-gardes of the early 20th century, Tafori appears to retell the same story in episode after episode, like a theme with variations. Whether the context is Germany, the Soviet Union, or the United States, and whether the scale is architecture, stage design, or the city, the account is of how radical and reform-minded architects, designers, and urban planners, believing they had a role to play in the construction of new societies, became unwitting pawns in techno-bureaucratic regimes of power and production, and ultimately the accomplices of the different world systems of rationalization. This insistent refrain gives Tafori's argument a decided sense of closure. The 5 central chapters of the book are framed by an opening 2 essays on Piranesi, in which the 18th century architect and draftsman is made to function genealogically as a proto-avant-gardist, the earliest architect to discover the principle of transgression as a mode of subversive aesthetic activity. And then, in the 2nd chapter, Piranesi is shown to have had a major influence on the Soviet film director, Sergei Eisenstein, which allows Tafori to make the leap from the 1750s to the 1920s. The book concludes with 2 chapters on the architecture of the 1960s and 70s. The illustrations construct an extremely rich and metaphoric narrative in their own right, and these are the first and last images in the book. Among the utopian ghosts rising from the wreckage of the avant-garde of the 1920s are a series of idealistic cultural producers who, as we just said, had undertaken to give form to a principle of hope and to participate in the construction of new worlds, from Ella Zitsky to Hannes Meyer and Ernst May to Raymond Hood. It might be noted that the American chapter, which is titled The New Babylon, the Yellow Giants and the Myth of Americanism, is somewhat discordant with respect to the others. And Tafuri, in fact, acknowledges the problem of applying his concept of the avant-garde to a form of architectural production that would probably be better characterized as pragmatist. Yet the chapter, that's his characterization, yet the chapter partly concerns the European avant-garde's response to the advent of the American skyscraper, and in any case, it is necessary to the larger argument Tafuri is advancing about the process of modernization as a global phenomenon. It also sets up the book's denouement, which comes in those final two chapters, respectively titled L'architecture dans le boudoir and The Ashes of Jefferson. Here, new ghosts enter the scene. A major protagonist in both chapters is the American architect Louis Kahn. Tafuri casts Kahn as a late modern master whose lingering civic idealism in the post-war period channels the Enlightenment spirit of Thomas Jefferson. Yet such idealism appears to him to be steeped in nostalgia and self-mystification. And at the same time, and in a purely dialectical but also Oedipal fashion, Kahn's other emerges in these chapters in the figure of Kahn's heretical protege, Robert Venturi. Tafuri writes, to the promise of Kahn, namely communication is possible by giving voice to institutions, Robert Venturi has responded with the following objection: the only institution is the real. Only the real speaks. So if Kahn produced a school of mystics without religions to defend, I'm quoting Tafuri here, Venturi has in fact created a school of the disenchanted without any values to transgress. Venturi's return to the real, in other words, failed to offer contemporary architecture any new foundation, but rather represented a facile affirmation of the degraded world of commodities. For Tafuri, the two strategies were equally untenable, and his judgment is harsh. Quote, in the operation of overturning performed by Kahn and Venturi, it makes little difference whether the material of their new image system is made up of dreams of non-existent institutions or of nightmares dominated by the crowding together of the ephemeral icons of cosmic merchandization. The order without center of Kahn and the too ambiguous of Venturi find in this their fluctuating point of convergence. Banham, of course, would read these two figures in a completely different way. For Banham, Kahn was responsible for the bold Richards Medical Laboratories, a building that had the audacity to exhibit its mechanical service on its outside, even services on the outside, even to fetishize them with its thesis of servant and served space. And Venturi at least sensed the necessity for architects to tap into the energies emanating from the world of popular culture, much as the Smithsons had done in the 1950s when they wrote their manifesto, "Today we collect ads." Yet Tafuri sensed something else, indeed a second Enlightenment ghost lurking behind the spirit of Jefferson, that of the Marquis de Sade. Underlying the projects of the international avant-garde of the 1970s was, he found, a cruelly disenchanted and hedonist impulse, sadomasochistic in its acknowledgement of late modern architecture's impotence. In the jokes of I should make clear that the title, Architecture in the Boudoir, is taken from the Marquis de Sade's book, Philosophy in the Boudoir, in which Sade argues that in order for the boudoir to preserve its powerful ambiance of pure eroticism, nothing should penetrate the walls of the boudoir. The boudoir should be absolutely sealed from everything outside, and that's the metaphor Tafori uses to write about the autonomy, the aspiration to, or fantasy and desire for autonomy of certain architects in the 1960s and 70s. But in other words, to ward off an outside and to give itself the illusion of potency at a moment of impotence. But here, as one can read in this quotation from Aldo Rossi's scientific autobiography, already a growing sense that architecture couldn't do anything. It had no agency. Only small things would be possible. So in the jokes of a Venturi or a Koolhaas or a Krier, a Holine or Isozaki on the one hand, or on the other hand, the rigorous aesthetics of architects like Aldo Rossi, James Sterling, or the Five Architects of New York, Tafori saw kind of inversion of the same syndrome. In either case, what once upon a time in the 1920s had been languages of battle had now devolved into languages of pleasure. And the pleasure of this often highly accomplished and exquisitely rarefied work was all intellectual. There is clearly no social value in this, he writes. Among the experiences that occasioned Tafori's writing of the Ashes of Jefferson, which also revolves metaphorically around a Nietzschean interpretation of Manhattan as a new Venice, was his visit to New York in 1974. The city at that moment was on the verge of bankruptcy, and a competition for a second phase of housing on Roosevelt Island would shortly be canceled, relegating the entries to paper speculations presented in an exhibition in October 1975 and a catalog published by the Architectural League. Among the spectrum of entries, which ranged from the more to the less buildable, was a project by Robert A.M. Stern, which pays tribute to Jane Jacobs, and despite its lackluster quality, was one of 4 to be singled out for commendation by the jury. Another is by O.M. Ungers, which is close to the one that Rem Koolhaas and Ilya Zangelis of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture would also produce for this competition, and later, just right after, undertake another project for Roosevelt Island that would be published by Koolhaas in his book, Delirious New York. And I should note that it's very instructive to read side by side or against each other Koolhaas's Delirious New York and the chapter on the American skyscraper in The Sphere and the Labyrinth, or an earlier version of it, longer version of it, in the book The American City, where Tafori writes the chapter that's called The Disenchanted Mountain. Yet another competition entry was this one, titled Et in Arcadia Ego, and it was submitted by a team that included the former Archigram members Peter Cook and Ron Herrand, and had been carried out at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies with input from Peter Eisenman. In fact, you can see Eisenman, if you could read that, I don't think so. Eisenman is credited as one of the authors of the project. This last scheme, for some reason, evokes the cylindrical parking structures of Louis Kahn's Philadelphia plan, repurposing them, though, in a move clearly more Sadian than Kahnian, as defensive 6-story residential silos. Well, as a further ironic coda to this story of the Roosevelt Island competition and its connection to the Ashes of Jefferson, it would be Kahn who got the last word with the posthumous reconstruction in 2012 of his late project for a memorial to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that was inspired by the latter's For Freedom's speech. This project, which Kahn was carrying when he expired in Pennsylvania Station in New York in 1974, has now been resurrected from the ashes, as it were, on the southernmost tip of this bit of land. But there's also another spiritual, we could say, intertext for Tafori's essay, The Ashes of Jefferson, one that has largely been overlooked. In his long poem, The Ashes of Gramsci of 1954, Pier Paolo Pasolini pays homage to Italy's most important 20th century political theoretician and co-founder of the Italian Communist Party, a philosopher with whom Pasolini identified, as Alberto Moravia has noted, in his own aspirations as a civic poet, mourning the passing of an epoch when it was still possible to envision the possibility of a great national public art that would engage the working class with whom he felt so much solidarity. Pasolini writes elegically in this autobiographical poem, "But I, with the conscious heart of one who can only live in history, will I ever again be able to act with pure passion when I know our history is over?" Much like Tafori in the realm of architecture, Pasolini was engaged in the 1960s in a polemical attack on the neo-avant-garde in Italian literature, accusing the generation of Italian writers who were coming to the fore at that time not only of perpetrating an empty formalism, but of being fully integrated into the economic and political structures of their day. Thus, the cemetery consecrated by Tafori to the ashes of architectural thought in the 1970s has more than a little affinity with that dedicated by Pasolini to Gramsci. More than 3 decades later, today, how many degrees of separation exist between ourselves and the late modern anguish of a Tafori or a Pasolini? Or to take yet another example, more minor one, of an architect and critic who found it hard to give up the ghost of modernism, Peter Blake. Blake's book, God's Own Junkyard, in many ways anticipates the monumental postmodernist poem Junk Space by Rem Koolhaas, adjusting for a shift in scale from nation to world. But Blake opens his diatribe on the despoliation of the American landscape by stating, "This book is not written in anger, it is written in fury." Koolhaas, on the other hand, revels in his own black humor, at least ostensibly. Is the difference of affect here a measure of the distance traveled from the 1960s to the 1990s? Or is cynicism a facade with Rem, a Taforian mask for deeper despair, his exorbitant performance betraying no less outrage than Blake's juxtaposed photographs and captions? It's difficult to say whether architecture, by the turn of the 21st century, has had its surfeit of irony and cynicism. In the wake of recent dalliance with the so-called post-critical, and after episodes like 9/11, I guess we could add, many young architects and students today clearly seem to be searching for a different stance. And if we feel it is possible today even to hold out a slight hope to a new generation of critically minded architects, some small justification for optimism of the will in the face of pessimism of the mind, Gramsci again, We might begin by acknowledging the new roles architects will certainly have to play in the near future in coping with the problems of the contemporary urban world. Architects obviously cannot solve the ever-widening disparities of wealth and poverty, the increasingly lethal destruction of the built environment by themselves. Yet it's my belief that simply by virtue of the advance of urbanization, an emergent fact, not a hope, that the labors of the architect in the future are bound to be less and less a trivial pursuit, less and less entailing a production of negligible objects, as Tafori would have put it, even if architects thought it was one as recently as the 1970s and 80s. There is always, as Tafori has demonstrated, the danger of being seduced by new ideological configurations. Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapelleau have described the new spirit of capitalism in their 1999 book with that Weberian title as a self-justifying ideology. The celebratory ethos of globally interconnected networks, digital media, flexibility, the innovative talents of a new creative class, so-called immaterial labor, etc., cannot disguise the fact that we are still also bodies with organs. These bodies continue to subsist in substandard housing, to work on dangerous construction sites, to spend time in inhospitable hospitals and schools, as well as in unimaginative and soulless spaces, the last of which afflict everybody. Architects will not erase again the destitution, precarity, and alienation that capitalism, by its very nature, incessantly unleashes. Nor can they function as autonomous agents. The Sadian Boudoir that Tafori identified was a defense mechanism against the erosion of the discipline. Yet called upon to intercede in specific situations where the relations of contemporary production are playing out in built space, critical architects, with their eyes open, may, I think, rise to the occasion. Whether this is pragmatism or utopianism is hard to say. Such a stance, no doubt, risks succumbing to the same disenchantment to which the critical architects and theorists of the generation of '68 fell victim. Yet more meliorist than revolutionist, we might take a longer view, demanding, with Gramsci again, a slog through existing institutions, including all the expanded and intricately interwoven professional, social, and other sites of our age. One thing is clear, and to return to our dialectical frame again, the critical architectural thought of our day will have to pass beyond both technological triumphalism and historical helplessness. In an often quoted passage from his unfinished magnum opus, The Arcades Project, Walter Benjamin averred that dialectical thinking was the organ of historical awakening. With the destabilizing of the market economy, Benjamin wrote in 1935-36, we begin to recognize the monuments of the bourgeoisie as ruins even before they have crumbled. Today, the market economy continues to erect ever more spectacular monuments to itself, and its destabilizing effects hardly give more reason for revolutionary optimism than they did in the 1930s. No dialectical synthesis is at hand, but rather than blowing backward into the future, we would be better off engaging the incoming weather head on. Thanks.